He is a professor emeritus. He is former president of the ANS, vice president of ICOS. He's been 34 years on the Washington Board of Geographic Names, and he's done many, many presentations at our conference and has published many papers in our journal Names as well. So now he's working mostly on literary onomastics and philosophy of language. He has a new book, which is called Names as Metaphors in Shakespeare's Comedies, which is available at Vernon Press. And today he's going to be talking about names and sources in Cymbeline.
My name is Grant Smith. I'm professor emeritus at Eastern Washington University, and the title of my talk, Names and Sources in Shakespeare's Cymbeline. This is part of a long paper that I've drafted for publication, which is part of my goal to analyze the names in all of Shakespeare's tragedies. This paper follows my paper on Shakespeare's coinages presented here last year. My work on the tragedies complements my recent book. As you mentioned, I intend to present only my introduction of this paper today. I hope here to describe briefly how Shakespeare's uses of names in the tragedies reflect his varying reliance on different sources and his apparent presumption of their different status as fictive or non-fictive sources. Shakespeare's plays usually rely on a primary source plot taken from history books or previous literature. As such, his use of names not borrowed from the source plots, but added to them, is a useful indicator of his creative independence, his presumption of the fictive or non-fictive status of his sources, and of his relative reliance on those source plots. Cymbeline is unusual among Shakespeare's plays because its plot does not rely heavily on a single or primary plot source. The Winter's Tale is an interesting comparison because it was written very near in time to Cymbeline. It follows the plot of Greene's Pandosto very closely, but Shakespeare changes all the names, radically transforms the tragic ending into a positive tale of remorse, faith, and redemption. Shakespeare apparently considered Pandosto a fictive narrative frame that he could reinterpret with new names. Cymbeline, by contrast, relies on a mix of source plots, on at least 4 different source plots: a banishment story, a wager story, a tribute story, and a story of rustic nobility. The names Shakespeare uses in Cymbeline are not borrowed from the literary plots, but some are borrowed from the history plots. Of course, Shakespeare's integration of his plot sources shows the power of his imagination. That is to say, the names in Cymbeline show a clear distinction between Shakespeare's use of literary sources and historical sources. The first 2 of the Cymbeline plot lines, the banishment and wager stories, follow sources in Renaissance literature and include almost all new names added by Shakespeare, which are the primary focus of my research. The added names include names borrowed from literature other than the plot sources, names from common usage, and coinages. These new names illustrate a presumption of the fictive status of the plot source. The tribute story and the story of rustic nobility are drawn primarily from Holinshed's chronicles. Shakespeare uses the names in Holinshed and adds almost no new names to those plot sources. His use of the names thereby illustrates a general presumption of the non-fictive status of the plot source. It also reflects the historical interests of Shakespeare's royal audience. I shall now sketch the 4 plots and their sources. The play begins with the banishment of the hero, posthumous Leonatus, because he has married the king's daughter, Inogen, whose social rank at birth is far above his. It is thus a story of cross-ranked lovers. The king and queen, Inogen's father and stepmother, want her to marry the queen's boorish son, Cloten. Posthumus was orphaned at birth, but raised at court by the previous king, Tenantius, because Posthumus's father, Caecilius, had won fabulous honors as a warrior. The play begins with the banishment of the hero because he has married the king's daughter, whose, I didn't, According to the opening dialogue by two gentlemen, all reference of Shakespeare, Posthumus, pardon me, I'm getting messed up here, grew up to exceed all the other men at court in looks and virtue, especially more than the loutish Cloten. Nevertheless, and despite the protests of his daughter, King Cymbeline calls Posthumus poison to my blood and banishes him from the kingdom. Posthumus flees to Rome, where he expects to find refuge at Valerio's, who to my father was a friend. In developing his banishment story, Shakespeare may have been influenced by many stories and plays about cross-ranked lovers. But as noted by Wayne, the rare triumphs of love and fortune is the most foundational of these other plays for Shakespeare's plot. The male hero of rare triumphs, Hermione, was a foundling reared by the king, but is eventually banished for loving the princess Fidelia. In exile, Hermione wanders into a cave with Beaumelio, who was previously exiled, much as Belarius, who also lives in a cave after exile in Cymbeline. Beaumelio turns out to be Hermione's father and was previously a respected lord of the realm. Two goddesses, Venus and Fortune, like Jupiter and Cymbeline, intervene and tell the king that Hermione inherits noble blood from Beaumelio, that he should bless the marriage of Hermione and Fidelia. Thus, the plot of Rare Triumphs tells a banishment story similar in several ways to Cymbeline. Also, Imogen uses the name Fidelia when searching in disguise for Posthumus, which is similar to Fidelia, the princess's given name in Rare Triumphs. However, except for the similarity of the two names, Fidelia and Fidelia, Shakespeare changes all the names found in Rare Triumphs to create his own version of the story. The result is that his version of the banishment plot is structurally similar to many Renaissance stories about cross-ranked lovers. Shakespeare complicates the banishment story by adding a wager story. And this plot line is the most fraught with uncertainty and by far the most relevant to character motivations. After Posthumus arrives in Rome, Valerio introduces him to four international friends: Giacomo, a name that marks him as Italian, a Frenchman, a Dutchman, and a Spaniard, all unnamed. They have just been discussing why Posthumus's admirable traits actually match his wife's royal status. But Giacomo cynically suggests that Imogen, though appearing innocent, can be seduced. He taunts Posthumus into a wager. When Posthumus accepts, Giacomo immediately leaves for England. When Giacomo meets Imogen, he quickly concludes that she cannot, in fact, be seduced. But he asks her to keep a trunk of treasure for him overnight. He hides in the trunk and comes out in the middle of the night to make an inventory of her room, notes a mole on her left breast, slips off her bracelet, and climbs back into the trunk. His servants retrieve the trunk in the morning, and when he returns to Rome, he convinces Posthumus that he has won the wager. Posthumus bewails the frailty of women, writes a letter to his loyal servant, Pisanio, to murder Imogen, and writes to Imogen to go with Pisanio to Milford Haven, where he will meet her. Posthumus also joins the Roman army to invade England. When Posthumus receives a bloody handkerchief from Pisanio, he believes it betokens Imogen's death. He is struck with remorse and asks, how many men must murder wives much better than themselves for lying but a little? He cries out that his own faults deserve more vengeance from the gods than Imogen's, and that she was given no chance to repent and fall no more. To show his own repentance, he strips off his Roman uniform, puts on the clothes of a peasant, and joins the ragtag British army. After the Romans are surprisingly defeated, Imogen sheds her disguise as a boy. Giacomo confesses, and the international order is restored. The best known antecedent of the wager story is novella 9 of day 2 in Boccaccio's Decameron. As in Cymbeline, the villain, Ambrogio, gets into the wife's bedroom in a chest, steals personal items and notes a bowl under her left breast. As noted by below, many other versions of the story have stemmed from Boccaccio's. However, the Decameron was not available in English until 1620. Thus, Shakespeare probably relied directly on a later version, specifically a German rendition of Boccaccio translated into English as Frederica of Jena and printed in both 1518 and 1560. Bellow carefully traces the parallelisms in these two sources to suggest his greater reliance on Frederica. Shakespeare makes the wager story central to the plot of Cymbeline, but he uses it just as other writers did in the Renaissance, as a fictive narrative frame that is freely available for new thematic development by any writer. Just like other writers, Shakespeare changed all the names of his fictive source and makes not even a slight acknowledgement of that source. Now the tribute story centers on Britain's cultural legacy and was of great interest to King James. Thus, all the names that Shakespeare borrows from source plots of Cymbeline come from the source of the tribute story, suggesting thereby its non-fictive status. Indeed, the primary source of this plot was the second edition of Holinshed's The Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland. And the first volume describes how Cymbeline was king when Julius Caesar invaded England and enforced a yearly tribute of 3,000 pounds. Donatius succeeded Cymbeline as king and continued to pay tribute to Rome. Cymbeline was Donatius' son, was brought up in Rome and won such favor that he was at liberty to pay this tribute or not. Historically, controversy eventually arose over payment of the tribute. Holinshed disavows knowledge of how the controversy arose. Qualification by Cymbeline or some other prince of the Britons. Holinshed refers to the possibility of Cymbeline's son, Guiderius, denying to pay them tribute. Shakespeare transfers Holinshed's ambivalence to his portrayal of Cymbeline. My Caesar knighted me, my youth I spent much under him. He depicts the actual villains, Shakespeare predicts and depicts the actual villains as the unnamed queen and her son, Cloten, who seek to sever ties with Britain. The queen avows that Britain's refusal to pay the tribute shall be so ever, and with a crude ethnic slur to the presumed crooked noses of Romans, Cloten tells Caesar's ambassador, "We will nothing pay for wearing our own noses." King James had a keen interest in depicting Britain as a continuation of Roman culture, and it is a thematic emphasis of Cymbeline. Thus, Shakespeare meticulously portrays the king's stepson and the queen as the wicked threats to that theme. Here's never a moment on it. Shakespeare caps the tribute story with a story of rustic nobility based on an incident in Scottish history found in volume 2 of Holinshed's Chronicles. In 990 CE, the Scottish king, Kenneth III, faced defeat at the hands of invading Danes at the Battle of Cloncarty. Scottish soldiers were in orderly retreat through a narrow lane between barriers of ditches and turf when a farmer and his two sons confronted them, turned them back, and led them in the fighting. The battle turned, the Scots prevailed, and the king honored the heroic farmer named Hay with knighthood and riches. Of course, the knighting of the farmer was a formal recognition of nobility that is presumed to be inherent wherever it might be found, even among the rustics. In Cymbeline, Shakespeare superimposes the plot of rustic nobility as an ending to the tribute story. The Roman army sent to enforce the tribute has Cymbeline's army retreat in a narrow lane until the exiled Valerius, with two striplings, sons, orders the Britons to stand, and thus, like Farmer Hay, and with Posthumus's help, Belarius and his sons turned the British rout into a rather miraculous victory. Shakespeare uses this story to suggest parallels with events in his own time. Cymbeline was most likely written in 1610. And the great event of 1610 at court was the investiture of Prince Henry as the Prince of Wales. As Wayne notes, the militaristic young prince was known to have a passion for history, especially British history, fed with chronicles such as Holinshed. The Battle of Lancarty was a salient event in that history. And Prince Henry could have easily identified himself imaginatively as the unnamed elder son of a farmer named Hay. Also, two events associated with the investiture suggest that the prince was encouraged to imagine such a parallelism. In January of 1610, a martial contest was arranged to demonstrate Henry's maturity and readiness to rule. It was called Prince Henry's Barriers. It involved the prince and 6 assistants facing 8 defendants sequentially in opposite sides of a barrier. They pursued mock battle while speeches were made describing British history and Arthurian romance. That is to say, Henry actively sought historical role-playing in an event staged to imitate the Battle of Lancarty, as noted by Wayne. Sir James Hay actively assisted in arranging Prince Henry's barriers as a spectacle. Not by chance, the week-long investiture also included the formal knighting of Sir James Hay as a Knight of the Bath. Sir Hay was one of King James's oldest friends and prided himself on being directly descended from the farmer hero of Lancarty. By knighting him as a part of these elaborate investiture festivities, King James not only recognized Hay's claims of ancestry, but also affirmed the symbolic importance of Lancarty and the descent of his own sovereignty from the time of Kenneth III. In Cymbeline, Shakespeare uses no name from Holinshed's account of the Lancarty battle, but his rustic nobility story draws a parallel meaning to the knighting of Sir James Hay. Because the sons of the farmer named Hay were not named by Holinshed, Shakespeare was free to suggest parallels between the sons of Cymbeline, Guiderius and Arviricus, and the sons of King James, Henry and Charles, respectively. Obviously, Prince Henry and his younger brother might have eagerly identified with such dramatic actions. Thus, Cymbeline seems likely to have been written near in time and performed specifically for, or at least as a complement to, the knighting ceremony, which was in turn an integral part of the investiture festivities of 1610. Shakespeare's use of names from the historical source suggests a general presumption of its non-fictive status, at least that such people existed, even though their actions and motivations might be differently depicted. At the same time, Shakespeare's additions and changes of names suggest the opposite, that the Renaissance sources are simply frames, freely available for his or anyone else's adaptations and thematic development. Thus, Shakespeare used plots from Renaissance sources to enhance the historical action as drama. In Cymbeline, most dramatic action is driven by the wager story, but Shakespeare changes all the names found in the sources for that plot, i.e., he borrows no names from Boccaccio or Frederica of Yenin. The same is true of the banishment story, which precipitates the central action. Shakespeare seems to have been most influenced by the rare triumphs, but he borrowed none of the names from that play for his own play. All of the names in Cymbeline that are borrowed from source plots are borrowed from Holinshed, the source plot of the tribute story. Of course, some of these names also appear in the other storylines, but they all come from the first volume of Holinshed, which describes the formative history of Britain and its links to Roman culture and occupation. King James and Prince Henry were familiar with Holinshed, had strong interest in seeing Britain as a continuation of Roman culture, and welcomed such imagery in the pageantry of the prince's investiture. The draft of this paper proceeds to describe the specific names associated with the four plots and their sources, but my time for this presentation has expired. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Grant. That was great. Let's see, do we have some questions from the audience? Anna.
Oh, it's so good to see you.
I'm very happy to see Grant Smith and everybody here. Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. And now when I'm into Shakespeare's names, well, because I'm also preparing some kind of a talk for the conference, I was comparing translations of names in Shakespeare's plays. And as far as I understand, posthumous is a random denama.
I classify it as a common name insofar it is documented in use during the Renaissance. And it's purely descriptive. It is lexically clear. And so the meaning of the name is clear. It is not a coinage. It is not necessarily a borrowing. It is something that existed in the culture at the time because of its lexical meaning. I take the names, from the history sources and classify those, but then there are other names that are borrowed from other Renaissance literature that are not sources for the plot. So a distinction I'm trying to draw here is between plot sources and then other sources. And the plot source for the historical part, he borrows all the names, but he borrows none of the names from his literary plots that he's following. He's following a wager story, he's following a banishment story, and but he doesn't borrow any names from those sources. But he does borrow a lot of names from other places, and he coins names, and he uses names from the common onomasticon, the names current in use in his society. And posthumous is one of those names that are in current use.
Do you think it should be? Yeah, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Do you think it should be translated? Because I checked it in the Russian translation, so they don't translate it; they just transliterate it as posthumous, something like that.
It's common. It's common in many languages. In other words, the exact phrase comes from Latin and simply describes someone who was born after the father dies. And in this particular play, of course, it is emphasized that the son was born after the father dies and the mother dies giving birth. And so posthumous is a total, stranger in the land without any other relatives. And Shakespeare really emphasizes that point in the play. But it's a name that is lexically clear.
Yes,
from
it is lexically clear. Well, for the English speaker, but it's unclear. It's non-transparent in the Russian translation. It's just posthum, and well, if you don't know the English or Latin, you will not get it.
But it comes from Latin. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, of course, Russian is not. It's not very closely related to Latin at all. It's Slavic. So that's a particular problem from your point of view.
Yeah.
But there were people in Shakespeare living in Shakespeare's time that had the name posthumous. So I have to count it as an existing name.
Mhm.
Grant, I have a question.
Sure.
Do you sense patterns in the way Shakespeare changes names? You know, like in talking about Cymbeline, you said some of them are taken from one source and then others he made up, and then others are taken from other sources. Is there like a rhyme or reason to how he assigns these names? Or is it just he felt like it?
Well, there's a lot of he felt like it, particularly with the more minor characters. He's sometimes quite flippant, particularly in his comedies. But if we can look at the coinages, which I really think are kind of really interesting, sometimes he's playing with sound. And sometimes he's making a reference to even some object. And the example of Dogberry in Much Ado About Nothing is a reference, it's a scatological reference. So it's something that he's referring to very, very clearly, and drawing an analogy that you can consider. And there's been a lot of commentary about whether it's metaphorical or metonymical, you know, the kinds of connections that he's making. And I think these are very useful distinctions if we want to get into, you know, the nature of figurative speech and the distinction between the various figures. Well, Dickens' novels, he's using primarily sound, you know, to coin his names. He's really very imaginative with sound. Shakespeare is, I think, imaginative with sound and with topical references a lot. But usually with minor characters, although with Othello, that's purely a phonological analogy, I believe. It simply comes from, oh, tell, oh, it's an invitation to please explain, or to tell stories, such as the story told to Desdemona to, well, to win her love.
Okay, well, thank you, Grant. That was great.
Thank you for your
Okay.
time.